The Honourable David Parker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to carry on while we're debating this part with the discussion that we've just commenced through Stuart Nash on tax credits for R&D tax losses. Sir, the history to R&D tax losses in our tax legislation needs to be referred to. For many years, New Zealand has had a low level of expenditure on research and development in the private sector relative to other OECD countries. Stuart Nash is quite right when he points out that the incentive to underreport R&D development expenditure is higher in New Zealand than it is in other countries because you can't claim a tax deduction for a lot of that expenditure, and you're meant to capitalise it and then amortise it. And if, as a taxpayer, you can categorise that as another category of expense and therefore get a tax deduction in the year it's spent, you're better off to do that. And as a consequence, there will be some areas of research and development expenditure which are reported as R&D expenditure in other countries which actually are appearing as other categories of expenditure in New Zealand in order to get that tax deduction. Notwithstanding that, there is almost universal agreement in New Zealand that levels of research and development expenditure in New Zealand are lower than they are in other, this private sector R&D are lower than other countries, even when you adjust for that anomaly, and that's one of the reasons why New Zealand's export performance is worse than it would otherwise be. Now, because of that historic underinvestment in research and development, the last government, in the last term of that government, introduced a research and development tax credit of 15% of qualifying expenditure. The current government came to power and they axed it. And they axed it in order to fund, amongst other things, a decrease in the corporate tax rate to, I think it was 28 cents in the dollar. Was it initially from, was it 30 to 28, or was it, we'll go down in two stages, I forget the history, but it went from 30 down to 28%, and they also funded income tax cuts, which were, as other people have said in other parts of this debate, weighted to those who are at the higher end of the income spectrum, with 40% of the income tax cuts going to the top 10% of income earners. Now, the Labour Party at the time was critical of that because we thought that although it was true that some of the money that was received by companies for R&D tax credits would effectively be a tax credit for what they already spent, albeit characterised as other sorts of expenditure, overall it would have lifted the increase of research and development tax expenditure, and that was modelled by the Treasury. The Treasury opposed the abolition of the research and development tax credit and said, as a consequence, New Zealand's economy would be weaker as a consequence. The Inland Revenue Department at the time opposed a research and development tax credit, and I think it's a matter of public record of a lot of those people who went through the initial stages. They actually found the Inland Revenue Department at that stage quite unreasonable in the way in which they implemented the controls around the research and development tax credit and made it difficult to access. In any event, what happened subsequently to that was that the government found that the export target of increasing exports from 30 to 40% of the economy went wrong. Indeed, exports as a percentage of the economy, instead of increasing from 30 towards that 40% target, have gone backwards and have dropped to 30% dropped to under 30% of the economy, to around 28-29% of GDP, and still dropping. Now, as a consequence of that, the government says, well, we've got to do more than we're currently doing in respect of research and development incentivisation, and they have, in this subpart MX of this bill, introduced these new rules in respect of smaller entities that are intensively investing in research and development, that don't have other areas of income that they can take advantage of, that they can offset their qualifying research and development expenditure against, and therefore ought to be able to get it paid out to them as a credit, particularly when they're small countries and they're cash flow they are cash flow negative. And the Labour Party supports that, and that's why we are supporting this part of the bill. But I do want to highlight the what I think is the inconsistent arguments, Mr. Chairman.
Honourable David Parker.
The inconsistent arguments that have been run against research and development tax credits generally by what's happening here. The government said that research and development tax credits were too complex to operate, and yet they've actually got a system here that is more complex than you would have if you had universal rules. And Stuart Nash has gone through some of the definitions of the eligibility criteria to determine whether you come within these rules. Now, look, I want to incentivise research and development tax expenditure in New Zealand, and I don't object to it to being done for these companies, but it is somewhat ironic that the government said that they oppose these sorts of initiatives because of complexity, and yet the rules surrounding this include rules relating to the R&D intensity of a firm. In order for them to qualify, the R&D intensity is set, or the clause MX1 says that this subpart only applies to a person, which includes a company, it's a corporate person as well, if the wage intensity criteria in section MX3 are met, and that there are intellectual property outcomes that are intended for the benefit of the company. Now, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chairman, to get to what that means, you then have to look at section MX3, which sets out the wage intensity criteria, and it is complex, and it sets out a formula which has a different rate, for example, that you can claim in respect of contracted out R&D expenditure compared with that which is done internally. Now that's at subclause 3 of the formula in MX3. Then it says that it sets out proportions that you can claim for each of them. It then, then in the next section sets out that that there has to be a tax credit equal to at least these amounts. The amounts that are set out for various years are very, very complex. Then it says that the MX5B, which I don't quite understand, and I'd be interested to hear the Minister explain it, having at MX5 said that you've got to extinguish a tax loss to the extent that you've had an R&D tax loss credit, which is fair because you don't want the government paying out a tax loss credit and then people carrying forward an R&D tax loss, which could then in a future year be used to reduce your income tax when you were in profit. That would not be fair, so they're stopping double dipping there. But then MX5B says that the is titled Deduction of Increase in the Basic Tax Rate for the company, and when this section applies, it says that if a person has an R&D loss tax credit for a tax year, which they call the credit year, before the current year, for which the basic tax rate for the company is increased, the rate increase, if the rate increase results in the basic tax rate for a company that is greater than the basic tax rate for the latest year or the credit year, then various formulas apply. Now, again, the complexity of this is extraordinary, and for the government to persist in pretending that their mistake in abolishing the R&D tax credit wasn't a mistake, and to come back with this narrower version of a credit for a research and development tax credit in terms of the ambit of the economy to which it applies, which is narrower than the former R&D tax credit, and to pretend that 7 years into their government, with exports going down as a percentage of the economy instead of up as they promised, is galling. And I would like the Minister to take a call and say, how can the government support this provision in respect of a narrow set of research and development and logically oppose broader research and development tax credits? If this sort of tax credit is accepted as stimulating research and development effort in a way which benefits our economy, grows the breadth of our exports, grows the sophistication and value of our exports, why does that same argument not hold true in respect of other areas of research and development not covered?
Mark Mitchell.